It sat there like a forgotten scar, nestled in the back corner of a two-story post-war apartment block in a quiet suburb of Berlin, a district where dogs barked on schedule and neighbors nodded in polite silence, but never asked questions they didn't want answered. The building, gray and chipped, wore its age without apology, a relic from a time when walls didn't just divide homes, but ideologies. The room in question, door rusted over and marked only with faint chalk scrawls long since faded, was wedged between the garbage chute and an emergency stairwell no one used. Most residents assumed it was a utility closet or an overfilled janitor's cupboard left to molder with old buckets and spider webs. Some thought it belonged to the landlord, a dead-eyed man who hadn't shown his face since East became West. Others claimed it used to be part of a bomb shelter, and that there were dozens like it all across the city, sealed, abandoned, irrelevant. For decades, no one thought twice about it. It never made a sound. It didn't leak. It didn't smell. It was invisible by virtue of being dull. And dullness, in Berlin, was a kind of camouflage. But in the autumn of '92, 3 years after the wall fell and the city began to tremble under the weight of its new identity, a new property inspector was sent to review the building's fire safety compliance. His name was Victor Hesse, young, curious, annoyingly thorough. With clipboard in hand and a keyring that jingled like a jailer's ghost, he moved from floor to floor, tapping pipes, squinting at yellowed schematics, and noting violations with a red pen that bled authority. He checked meters, locks, fuse boxes, and then he came to the unlabeled door. The key didn't fit. Not at first. The lock was old, almost antique, and refused to yield. Hesse hesitated, checking his notes. No one had listed the room, no resident claimed it, no emergency plan mapped it. With a crowbar borrowed from a reluctant janitor, he wedged the door open. The metal groaned like it hadn't moved in a lifetime. What he saw inside did not belong to any modern understanding of a storage unit. No shelves of cleaning supplies, no dusty furniture. Instead, the room opened into a claustrophobic cell of copper wires, dark boxes with red switches, and a heavy desk bolted to the concrete floor. On the far wall, mounted with surgical precision, was an antenna coil, coiled like a sleeping snake, and beside it, a faded Soviet emblem half peeled from paint, but unmistakably present. The air was stale but charged, as if the walls still remembered frequencies that hadn't been heard in years. Hesse stood frozen, breath tight, eyes wide. Somewhere behind him, the hallway fluorescence flickered. In that moment, the hum of the city outside, the traffic, the wind, the clatter of life, fell away. All that remained was the static in his ears, the crackle of history whispering through dust, and the first, undeniable realization. This room had a secret. Victor Hesse had opened many doors in his new job, but this one clung to the frame like it didn't want to let go of what was inside. It hissed and shuddered as the rusted hinges finally gave way, revealing a room that time itself seemed to have skipped over, as if 1985 had been preserved in amber and left to hum in silence behind iron. Dust coiled in the air, thick and slow, like it had its own gravity, and beneath it all, rows of outdated yet meticulously arranged radio equipment lined the walls, stacked receivers, frequency modulators, switchboards with Soviet-issue frequency tags, and what appeared to be a power amplifier unit jury-rigged to a transformer no longer connected to the main grid. On a central workbench, the kind used for mechanical repairs or code typing, lay a cracked headset with cloth-wrapped wires trailing like veins into an open junction box, buzzing faintly with residual energy. Every piece of equipment wore the weight of intention. Nothing here had been left to rot by accident. It was stored, protected, and placed with exacting care. A rotary dial telephone sat crooked on a steel shelf, its handset warped with age but still intact, and beside it a clipboard, its paper yellowed but legible, filled with handwritten numbers that ran in columns, each line marked with Cyrillic initials. But it was the chair that chilled Victor the most. A thick black leather office chair, militarily rigid in its posture, bolted into the floor like a cockpit seat. On its headrest, scorched into the leather with a brand, not stitched or embossed, was the unmistakable hammer and sickle encased in a star. The Soviet emblem, faded yet defiant, seemed to leer from the shadows as if daring him to acknowledge what he was standing inside. Hesse didn't move. His instincts told him to call someone, report it, get backup, find an authority. But what authority existed anymore for relics like this? The wall had fallen, yes, but had the eyes behind that wall ever truly stopped watching? His hand hovered over the bench as he noticed an envelope, unopened, sealed in red wax with no markings, an anomaly among the otherwise mechanical clutter, oddly ceremonial. The fluorescent lights above flickered as if reacting to his hesitation, casting the whole room into a rhythmic dance of shadow and sterile white glare. A feeling prickled at the back of his neck. This wasn't just a forgotten bunker or a dusty Cold War artifact. It had been used, recently. A faint trail in the dust led to the far wall, where a gap in the floor tiles revealed a small conduit tunnel, one wide enough for a man to crawl through. And though the room was silent, Victor couldn't shake the sensation that the air was disturbed, as if someone had just been here, perhaps watching, perhaps listening, waiting for the door to open again after all these years. The routine inspection was no longer routine. This wasn't a room that had been abandoned. It was one that had been hidden, and, maybe, just maybe, still active. The next morning, under gray skies and an unsettling silence that seemed to cling to the apartment block, a team of maintenance workers returned to the mysterious room on Victor Hess's request, officially to catalog and dismantle what they assumed was outdated telecom equipment, unofficially to confirm that he hadn't imagined the room at all. And it was during the careful removal of a rusted wall panel that one of them, a quiet Bulgarian named Peter, tapped too hard and sent a brittle piece of drywall collapsing inward to reveal a narrow cavity stuffed with tightly rolled papers bound in fraying twine. At first glance, they looked like blueprints, old, decayed, probably just construction plans from the Cold War era. But when Victor unrolled one across the metal desk, flattening it beneath a cracked glass ashtray, the inked header stamped in red made his chest seize. Государственный комитет по радиосвязи, CCCP 1984, the Soviet State Committee for Radio Communications. The lines on the blueprint were not architectural, they were electrical and schematic in a way that spoke to a system beyond civilian comprehension. There were transmission towers marked with coded identifiers, relay stations drawn with embedded cryptographic modules, and at the heart of it all, a web of FM frequency bands ranging from 91.2 to 104.9 MHz, with annotations in Cyrillic specifying signal rotation cycles, staggered burst codes, and something labeled simply as Black Echo Protocol. Hesse, whose technical understanding of radio technology ended at the FM/AM dial in his mother's car, called in a friend from his university days, a retired radio engineer named Martin Kleist, who now restored antique receivers for hobbyists. When Kleist arrived and laid eyes on the schematic, his expression fell from curious to grave. These weren't simple communication systems, he explained. They were part of a classified Soviet frequency hopping array, a system designed to send encoded voice transmissions across secure channels by rapidly shifting signal bands faster than civilian receivers could track. At the bottom corner of one blueprint was a small inset map of West Berlin, with red X's overlaid in specific sectors, Schöneberg, Kreuzberg, and a particularly precise mark near the Zoologischer Garten station. Next to the X's were notes in a mix of Cyrillic and shorthand numerical strings that Kleist couldn't decipher, though he recognized the structure. They were drop-point notations, patterns used to identify locations where couriers might leave or retrieve physical data, photographs, microfilm, or cipher sheets. This wasn't merely a radio station. It was a listening post, possibly a relay center, perhaps even a control node, and its location in a nondescript East Berlin apartment block suggested it was not meant for broadcasting propaganda or civilian use. It had been hidden for a reason. Hesse turned back to the chair with the scorched emblem and imagined a man seated here, headphones pressed tight, sending words westward through wires coiled behind plaster and concrete, transmitting not to the world, but to someone specific, somewhere in Berlin, who was waiting for orders in silence. The blueprints had been folded with care. The twine that held them had not rotted. Whatever operation had lived in this room hadn't died of neglect, it had simply waited. Apartment 3B had always been a bit of an enigma, even in a building that excelled at ignoring itself. Its occupant never drew attention, never threw parties, never played loud music, never appeared drunk or unkempt, or involved in anything that warranted gossip. But once the discovery of the hidden radio station became known to a few key city officials, Victor Hesse was granted limited access to old tenancy records retrieved from what remained of the East German housing archives, and what he found was stranger than silence. The name listed on the lease, Karl Metzler, corresponded to no East German citizen, no West German national, and no registered birth certificate in either state. In fact, the identification number provided on the tenancy file had been issued under a bureaucratic loophole once used by Stasi agents to mask intelligence operatives embedded within state-owned housing, all of which led to a dead trail, a man who never legally existed. When Victor began interviewing longtime tenants, those few who hadn't moved away after reunification or been shuffled out during the housing transitions, he found their recollections eerily consistent. They remembered Herr Metzler as impeccably dressed, tall but not imposing, with a receding hairline and glasses that gleamed under hallway lighting. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with an unusually crisp accent, the kind taught in GDR schools but rarely used outside official broadcasts, as though the man had learned German from a rulebook rather than a mother tongue. He was polite, said Frau Benz, who had lived one floor up since 1971, but not friendly, not in the way neighbors sometimes nod to each other or ask about the weather or shopping. He would smile, and it always felt like a performance. Others remembered him only by his habits. Always home after 6 p.m., curtains drawn within minutes, lights low. He walked with a deliberate pace, never hurried, never idle. He never received mail that anyone saw, and never took deliveries. But the most distinct detail, and the one repeated by nearly every person questioned, was the leather case, long, dark brown, aged like good luggage, and carried without fail whenever he left the building. Some assumed it held blueprints or engineering tools. Others whispered it might have been for a musical instrument. A violin, perhaps, though no one ever heard music from his apartment. One resident, a retired baker named Klaus Weller, recalled seeing the man once on the train platform at Friedrichstrasse, standing motionless on the edge of the crowd as if he were waiting for someone to notice him. He wasn't reading, Weller said. He was scanning. That's what I remember, like his eyes were tracking things the rest of us couldn't see. The man known as Metzler had vacated apartment 3B in early November 1989, mere days before the wall came down, and no forwarding address was filed. No one helped him move, no truck, no luggage, no farewell. One day, he was there. The next, only the dust in the hallway remained. When local papers picked up the strange discovery in apartment 3B, couched carefully as potential Cold War surveillance remnants uncovered in Berlin flat, a wave of curiosity rippled through the city's amateur radio community, and soon, aging hobbyists who had once filled their post-war evenings with static-laced transmissions and frequency hunting began to come forward with memories that, until now, had seemed like harmless mysteries from a fading era. Men with call signs like DL7XP and OE3NB began swapping notes over forums and clubs, sharing logs scribbled into yellowed notebooks with meticulous penmanship, all of them referencing a peculiar signal they remembered haunting the 100 to 102 MHz band from late 1985 until around the autumn of 1989. They described it as a low pulsing tone, 3 short beeps, 1 long, followed by a sudden high-pitched burst, repeating every 15 minutes with machine-like precision, regardless of weather, time of day, or interference. Some thought it was Soviet navigation telemetry bleeding over from military airfields. Others suspected it was East German jamming equipment left in standby mode. A few believed it was a calibration error in a long-range transmitter or a beacon meant for aircraft alignment during reconnaissance flights. But no one traced it to a civilian source, and certainly no one imagined it was coming from the basement of a residential block just outside Prenzlauer Berg. One operator, known then as Funkfreund Dieter, recalled trying to triangulate the signal out of pure boredom during the long winters of 87 and 88. His crude directional antenna had led him to within 2 kilometers of the source, but failed to narrow it further, lost in the concrete noise of the urban sprawl. It was always strongest around Schwederstrasse, he remembered, but there were so many buildings, and I never imagined someone would broadcast from inside a flat. Another, a Polish ham operator visiting friends in East Berlin in 1988, recalled tuning into the signal while idling near a coffee shop with a portable receiver. He thought it was a weather pattern at first, until the signal abruptly changed pitch mid-cycle, something automated systems were not supposed to do. He wrote it down, shrugged, and forgot about it. Now, with the discovery of the relay blueprints and the KB-grade hardware found in 3B, all those little anomalies began to coalesce into something far more sinister. Someone had been broadcasting through the Cold War's dying years, not to entertain or inform, but to communicate in the kind of code that lives between the gaps in ordinary hearing, brief, exact, and utterly deniable. The realization settled slowly. The apartment hadn't just been listening, it had been speaking. Perhaps not often, perhaps not even daily, but the signals had come from here, from behind those plaster walls, hidden inside a forgotten room. And those who had spent years chasing signals for fun now realized they had been spectators to something real, something state-crafted and ice-veined, a ghost in the airwaves whose whispers had always been just beneath the surface, waiting to be heard. It was wedged between the inner wall of the signal cabinet and the back panel, barely visible beneath a tangle of aging wires and brittle insulation tape. Its black leather cover warped from heat and time, a pocket-sized notebook, no larger than a man's palm, wrapped in a strip of cloth once white but now the color of nicotine and ash. Victor Hesse found it on his second search of the equipment room, guided not by protocol, but by a sense that the room was too orderly to not be hiding something personal, something meant only for one pair of eyes. When he opened it, the pages creaked like dry leaves, and there, in tight looping Cyrillic script that suggested both discipline and haste, was a series of carefully dated entries. No personal reflections, no names, no locations, just a rhythm of call signs, frequency pairs, time stamps, and, scattered between them like foreign punctuation, fragments of poetry that made Victor's skin tighten. "The silence swims beneath iron birds," one entry read. Another, "He walks in rooms where language ends." Some were shorter, nearly haiku-like. "Glass sky, no stars, static in the veins, send code, then sleep." Others were more disturbing in their intimacy. "I watched her through the steam, 2 spoons, 1 cup. The tea tasted of fear." Kleist, the radio engineer, brought in a translator fluent in Cold War-era Russian military parlance, and together they began to understand the true weight of what they held. The call signs aligned with known Soviet KGB relay protocols used during dead drop confirmations, shortwave affirmations that a package had been placed or retrieved, always followed by a confirmation phrase designed to blend as innocuous chatter. But here, in this notebook, the poetry seemed to serve not just as emotional venting, but as veiled confirmations themselves. "The crow lands at twilight, black wings folded in remorse." Translated by the KGB cipher structure, this could indicate a completed exfiltration or a failed rendezvous. Another line, "Snow falls twice on the bridge this month," matched a code phrase intercepted in 1987 by NATO intelligence regarding a defection attempt through Checkpoint Charlie. It was as if the agent, Metzler, or whatever his name truly was, had merged the languages of espionage and poetry into a private lexicon of control, creating a dual existence on the page: operative and observer, transmitter and dreamer, monster and man. The diary's final pages grew more erratic. Dates grew sparse. Words crossed out violently. One page entirely blacked out with thick charcoal ink. The last readable line, written in block letters beneath a short stanza about footsteps in snow, simply read, "No return signal. Disconnect." Victor stared at that phrase for a long time, imagining the moment it was written, the quiet, the knowledge, the finality. This was not just the record of a spy's actions. It was the slow unraveling of a man who had watched the world through sound and code and shadows, a man who had spoken in silence for years until there was no one left to answer. 3 days after the discovery of the hidden diary, the investigation shifted from historical curiosity to something far more urgent when a city-employed telecommunications engineer, Britta Hallberg, tracing the rat's nest of copper wiring snaking behind the station's rear panel, followed one particular line through the building's foundation. An insulated gray cable thicker than the rest, lacquered in dust but untouched by corrosion, and found that it led out of the building entirely, vanishing beneath the sidewalk and reappearing 5 blocks east at the perimeter of what had once been the VEB Post- und Fernmeldeamt, East Berlin's central telecommunications hub. A monolithic concrete structure long assumed to be gutted, stripped for parts and archived into irrelevance after reunification. But when Hallberg secured permission to investigate the disused facility, accompanied by a reluctant official from the Municipal Archive Office, they discovered something chilling. Sub-basement level 3, supposedly cleared in 1990, still contained an active subgrid, an isolated power relay running on an auxiliary loop, not connected to Berlin's primary utility system, but drawing voltage from an underground Soviet-era battery bank that had somehow never been decommissioned. The wire from apartment 3B fed directly into a relay junction labeled MIR7, and though most of the equipment nearby had been dismantled or rusted to uselessness, one panel was still operational, its diodes flickering like a heartbeat, pulsing at 40-second intervals. When Halberg ran a signal test, she expected dead silence. What she got instead was a burst of static, then a pause, then 3 short beeps, one long, and the same piercing high-frequency shriek that amateur radio enthusiasts had logged back in the 1980s. The sequence hadn't just been remembered, it had survived, and what's more, it had continued well into the modern era. An archived utility report from early '91 showed unexplained power draw anomalies on the old subgrid, flagged but never investigated, assumed to be instrument error. Halberg found timestamp records on thermal logs that showed bursts of energy consumption consistent with brief radio transmission periods. The last one dated April 18, 1991, more than a year and a half after the Berlin Wall fell, months after the reunification of Germany, and weeks before the dissolution of the KGB itself, which meant the room in apartment 3B had still been active, transmitting something even after the system it served had died. This wasn't a Cold War relic entombed in plaster and forgotten frequencies. It was a ghost signal, a final whisper from a regime that refused to be silenced, reaching through power lines and concrete like ivy through cracks. The revelation sent shockwaves through the small team now entrusted with the investigation. If the relay had remained live, who had been on the other end? Who had received those final signals? And perhaps, more unsettling, was someone still listening? The wire that was never cut now pulsed like a vein that had never stopped carrying blood. History, it seemed, was not just remembered in books or broken statues. Sometimes it hummed quietly through forgotten rooms, waiting to be found. When the authorities finally processed Victor Hess's request to access archived GDR passport records, now scattered across multiple agencies, many half-digitized and incompletely scanned, it took nearly a month to trace the identity attached to Karl Metzler, or at least to the forged documents he'd used. The name was linked to a single East German passport issued in 1981 under false civilian credentials, the kind typically manufactured for deep-cover operatives stationed within the interior, far from border checkpoints or diplomatic postings. And that passport had only one significant travel annotation, a blank re-entry stamp dated November 6, 1989. After that, nothing. No exit record, no official border crossing, no flights logged under his alias, no entries in hotel registries, bank ledgers, or telecom accounts. He hadn't defected to the West, hadn't boarded a train out of East Berlin, hadn't applied for political asylum, or disappeared into a new identity in Prague, Vienna, or Budapest, as so many had done in those desperate, dissolving months. He had simply vanished. 3 days before the Berlin Wall was breached, before border guards dropped their guns and the first chisels broke through concrete under tears and champagne, Metzler had signed a message in his radio logbook. No return signal, disconnect. And then he had gone. Was it a coded farewell, a final dead drop alert, a trigger phrase? No one knew. But records from the building show the front door lock was used that night around 3:12 a.m., and again at 3:14. 2 distinct clicks logged in the door's aging mechanical access register, which had been left untouched in the basement since the GDR's dissolution. 1 click in, 1 click out. No one remembered seeing him after that. Not the night doorman, not Frau Benz upstairs, not the old woman who fed stray cats by the dumpster and always claimed she could smell East German cologne from across the hall. For all intents and purposes, Metzler evaporated into the hours before the world changed. Some theorized he had been extracted, picked up by foreign agents who saw the writing on the wall and needed to remove assets before East Germany imploded. Others believed he'd been silenced by his own side, a quiet purging of liabilities in the final hours of the regime. But perhaps most disturbing was the possibility that he hadn't left at all, that somewhere in Berlin he had assumed another identity, melted into the wave of reunified confusion, and was still watching, still listening. Surveillance footage from the surrounding blocks was non-existent. The cameras had either been removed in the months prior or were never functional to begin with. And with East Berlin in political freefall, no one had kept track of every man who walked away in the fog. But Victor kept returning to the chair, the one bolted to the floor, scorched with that Soviet star, and wondered if Metzler had known the wall would fall, if his final message had been resignation or relief, or warning. Because as history surged forward and the world celebrated freedom, a ghost had slipped through the seams, untouched by revolution, unseen by victory, and utterly unaccounted for. Her name was Elfriede Markel, 92 years old and nearly blind in one eye, but her mind remained sharp enough to recall with haunting clarity the peculiar sounds that used to echo through her wall in the years before the wall fell. Soft, deliberate clicking noises late at night, always after midnight, always in staccato bursts that followed no rhythm a water pipe or radiator should make. She had lived in apartment 3C, directly adjacent to Metzler's unit, and though she had rarely spoken to the man, too polite, too clean, like someone pretending to be boring, she said, she remembered the sounds, the way they would start with a rapid series of taps and then pause, only to resume moments later with new, more deliberate pacing. At first I thought it was a mouse trapped behind the walls, she told Victor Hesse, as they sat in her cramped, doily-draped living room, surrounded by faded portraits and the scent of rosewater. But it was too patterned. Not chewing, not scratching. It was like someone typing, but with fingers made of metal. She had assumed it was the pipes, old East Berlin plumbing notorious for making all sorts of noises, until one night in 1908 when the tapping became particularly persistent, drilling into her sleep like an insect. Frustrated and half dreaming, she'd sat up in bed, padded over to the wall in her slippers, and knocked back. 3 times, sharp and angry. And then silence. For hours, not a creak, not a breath. She had gone back to sleep satisfied, but in the morning the quiet unnerved her. The noise didn't return for 2 nights, and when it did, it was softer, more cautious, like it was listening for her first. Sometimes, she confessed to Victor, her voice barely a whisper, I wonder what would have happened if I'd told someone. I thought I was just being a cranky old woman. Who wants to call the housing bureau over a few nighttime clicks? Her hands trembled slightly as she poured lukewarm tea from a chipped porcelain pot. But what if that was someone talking to someone? What if those knocks were answers to questions? She looked down at the cup. What if I knocked at the wrong time? The guilt wasn't overt, but it lingered at the edges of her sentences like smoke that had never cleared. She spoke of the quiet afterward, how Metzler seemed even more withdrawn in the hallway, how he started leaving his apartment only at odd hours, how once she'd caught a glimpse of him standing perfectly still in the stairwell window, not looking out, but watching his own reflection in the glass. He looked odd, she said, but not like someone who hadn't slept, like someone who had seen too much. Her regret wasn't theatrical, there were no tears, but it carried the weight of a woman who had brushed against a world she did not understand, and who, for all her years, now wondered if the barrier between ordinary life and espionage had been as thin as drywall, and if the difference between silence and salvation had once been her knuckles on a wall. Today, the room that once pulsed with encrypted transmissions, clandestine whispers, and ghost signals wrapped in static is just another tiled, fluorescent-lit laundry space, complete with humming machines, detergent-stained counters, and a faint mildew smell that never quite fades, no matter how often the janitor scrubs the grout. The old concrete walls have been painted over in institutional beige, the bolted chair replaced by a vending machine that occasionally eats coins, and the ceiling where antenna wires once slithered like copper vines now hosts a sagging fluorescent fixture that buzzes inconsistently, as if mimicking a frequency no one understands. Most of the residents have changed, and those who remain either don't remember or prefer not to. When asked, the building manager chuckles and says the place has no ghosts, just bad plumbing and a temperamental fuse box. But across Germany's small but fervent community of shortwave enthusiasts, a new legend has taken root in late-night forums and static-choked chat rooms that somewhere between 101.7 and 102.1 MHz, usually after 2 a.m., there are faint clicks that repeat in threes, followed by a long tone, and then, if you're lucky, a sharp, piercing burst that cuts through even the strongest white noise filters. Some say it's just leftover military equipment, ghost harmonics from old East Berlin towers that were never properly dismantled. Others insist it's electromagnetic bleed from distant satellites or badly shielded telecom grids. But the veterans, the ones who've been chasing signals since before the wall cracked, know better. They recognize the rhythm. "It's not interference," wrote one anonymous poster. "It's language." The clicks come irregularly now, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes back-to-back in strange clusters, but always with the same signature sequence, the same pulse that once came from apartment 3B. No one can trace it. Directional antennas yield conflicting data. One recording, captured near Dresden in 2017, includes what some interpret as a whisper, too garbled to transcribe, too distinct to dismiss. A retired British intelligence officer, when shown the waveform, only muttered, "That's not noise, that's a trigger." Theories abound. Some believe it's an old signal still looping through abandoned relays, an echo of a dead system unwilling to die. Others think it's deliberate, perhaps a call, perhaps a warning. And then there are those who believe that Metzler never left, that he simply became the signal, a man so bound to frequency and silence that his presence now rides the air itself, reaching out in encoded fragments to a world that forgot him. Victor Hesse, long retired from municipal work, keeps an old portable receiver by his window, just in case. He says he doesn't listen often, but when he does, and the static crackles just right, he sometimes hears the faintest echo of something not quite random, something deliberate, distant, and undeniably alive. And though the machines may spin and rinse and clatter over the room that once held the Cold War in its teeth, the air remembers, because some transmissions never stop, they just wait. If this story sent a chill down your spine, imagine what else still lingers beneath the surface of history. Subscribe for more forgotten Cold War secrets, mysterious broadcasts, and true stories that were never meant to be heard. Turn on notifications, because the next signal might already be out there.